When I think of today's theme of lighting the way, a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King comes to mind. Dr. King said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." So I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about love, about hate, and about making change. I was 18 years old when I first heard the word transgender. It was my first year of college, and I was taking a class called Introduction to Human Sexuality. As a part of that class, we watched a documentary that was called You Don't Know Dick. And that documentary featured a man named Jameson Green. Jameson Green was literally the first transgender man that I ever saw in my life. I'd grown up in a very, very small town in upstate New York, and if there were transgender people in that town, I didn't know about it. Jameson was the first person I ever heard to say the word transgender, and he was also the person who told me that my experiences were okay and that there were other people who were like me. After we watched that documentary, the next week, we had 4 transgender people come to our class as guest speakers, and they were talking to us and they were sharing about their lives and their stories and what it was like for them to be transgender. I don't remember their names. I don't remember much of what they shared, but I do remember very clearly what happened next. In an auditorium much like the one that we're in right now, one of my classmates stood up and he started yelling at our guest speakers. He told them that they were an abomination, that they were going to hell, that they were mentally ill, and that they were trying to deceive people about the sex that they were assigned at birth. In that moment, I understood a few things. Number one, that as a transgender person, this was going to be a difficult path for me. Because if people are willing to stand up and openly scream and yell at transgender people, I knew that there was something deeply troubling for others. The second thing that I knew was that he was scared. He didn't understand what it meant to be transgender, and so he reacted out of hate, and fear motivated that hate for him. So I realized that those two things are connected. And third, I realized that I didn't want to be a part of a world in which transgender people were screamed at, in which transgender people were hated. And so that started my journey for being an educator and doing work to end transgender prejudice towards transgender people. And so it's now 18 years later. I am the college professor who teaches Introduction to Human Sexuality. And I travel around the country and I teach people around what it means to be transgender, what transgender people's lives are, what our experiences are, what our challenges are in the world. Right? So this is part of my path of figuring out how to make the world a better place. The only reason that I'm able to do this is because there were many, many transgender people who came before me. There's so many activists, so many are named up here on the stage, but there's so many more. Right, so Sylvia Rivera and Miss Major were some of the first people who ever stood up for transgender rights. And there's been a long, long history of people who have come after that to try to make it possible for me to stand here on this stage. At the same time, we see that there's many other people now in the media, right? Caitlyn Jenner was not the first, and she's not the only one. We see people like Jazz Jennings, and we see people like Kyle Lums and the Wachowski sisters and Teak Milan and all these amazing people who are in the media in ways that have never happened before, which is amazing because that means that you can turn on the TV and you can see people who are transgender. And that's something I had when I was growing up. What we also see at this point is that the same people who were fighting to prevent same-sex marriage have turned their attention towards people who are transgender and are now targeting transgender people. Some of you may have heard this. Earlier this week in North Carolina, they passed a bill called HB 2. And what that bill did was it prevents transgender people from using affirming bathrooms in the state of North Carolina. That means that I wouldn't be able to use a men's room, and that means that many, many transgender people can never feel safe in a bathroom. A few days later, a similar law was passed in Mississippi. The same thing is happening there. We saw before that in Nebraska, LGBT people had their rights stripped. Any sort of legal protections towards discrimination were taken away. In Michigan, Tennessee, and Kansas, there's very similar legislation pending, except Kansas is taking it one step further. Kansas is requiring that schools pay $2,500 to any student who snitches on a transgender person who has used a bathroom in school. So what this means is that for transgender kids as young as 5 years old are trying to go to school, and a very simple thing that many of us take for granted of being able to use a bathroom is no longer an option. At the same time that this has happened, just before I was reading Facebook, and what I saw was that there are twice as many calls to the transgender suicide hotline since this bill has passed than it was for 2 weeks before it had passed. So what we see is this is having a really, really negative impact on people in transgender communities, young people and adults. And so transgender people are everywhere. They're in your school, they're in your community, they're in your neighborhood, whether you know this or not, right? And so one of the things that we need as transgender people is we need people who are allies. We need folks who are going to stand up and who are going to say, you know what, that's not okay. I'm not cool with that. I want to do something different. So I'm here to give you 5 specific things that you can do in your everyday lives. You don't have to travel around the country. You don't have to talk to people. You don't have to stand up on stage. You can just do this every day. And so these 5 things that I have for you. Number 1, I want you to learn about transgender people's lives, and I want you to share what you learn. As a part of that, it's going to be really important that you also learn about things like racism, classism, sexism, and homophobia, because all the things that transgender people face are also faced even more by transgender people of color, transgender people who are of low socioeconomic status, transgender people with different abilities. So part of what we need to do is we need to pull all these things together, we need to learn, and we need to share that information with others. The next thing is to use affirming names and pronouns. And what that means, if somebody tells you that they want to be called a certain name, and they want to be referred to as a girl or a boy, that you do that. You do whatever name and pronoun brings that person joy. Actually, one of the best things that you can do to be affirming for a transgender person is to say, hey, I see you, I respect you, I'm going to use the name and pronouns that are most respectful. The third thing is to be kind and to be friendly, right? It sounds like a very small thing, but in a world in which people are consistently getting messages about how we are hated because we are transgender, if you smile, if you give a nice compliment, if you hold the door open for somebody, that can actually change somebody's entire day because you may have been the only person who was nice that day. And so that can have huge power on somebody's life. The next thing that I'm going to empower you to do is interrupt prejudice where you see it. If some of your friends, your family members, anybody in your community is making remarks that are prejudiced about transgender people, I want you to stand up and I want you to say, hey, that's not okay with me. Please don't ever say things around me like that. I really care about transgender people, and that is hurtful and that is harmful. The fifth thing that I want you to do is I want you to look around your world and I want you to see where challenges might exist for transgender people. And I want you to advocate and try to take those challenges away. And by doing so, what you do is you take one place where a transgender person is not going to have to show up and fight that battle, right? So you do the work before they get there, so it's one less thing that they have to do. The only reason I'm able to stand on this stage today is because of people like Al and other allies who have stood up and who have said it's not okay for transgender people to be treated differently. I'm incredibly lucky. I get to live the life of my dreams, right? And that's something that I really wish for everyone. I wish for all of you in the room, but I wish for all transgender people. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is, as a part of your own justice work and your own way of creating a more fair and equitable world, is to stand up for transgender people and to make a difference. Thank you.